The Welsh Hercules, Snapshots of a Strongman's Life by S. Blockley and DJ Thacker. Available from Amazon. Chapter 1, 1905. Frank Owens looked out over the North Dock and swore. There were too many people. It was getting too popular. Anything with this number of men gathering in one place was sure to attract the police, and that wasn't good for business. He figured there were around 100 dockers present, some just leaving shifts, some that should be home asleep. There were even a couple who were supposed to be working right then, another red flag to those who might cause him trouble. If it were just the men, he reflected, he could probably handle it, but it was the hangers-on who were likely to create the biggest problems. The tarts were out in force. Owens's men were in the crowd collecting bets, but as long as men could be swayed towards spending their money on making a petticoat rise, he knew he'd never take as much as he should. North Dock was small and badly lit, and especially since the Prince of Wales Dock had been built, and whatever that new one was going to be that was currently under construction, it was largely used as a last resort. That made it the perfect venue for Owens, but it also made it a haven for the town's strumpets. In a way, he reflected, his event was actually stepping on their territory. That was not the case for the trade unionists, however. Gathered in a corner of the yard, banners higher than everyone else, they were as likely to cause a riot as win converts. He needed to get things started before someone said the wrong thing. Owens plunged into the crowd, pushing his way past fellow dockers until he was at the circle in the centre of the yard. After the crush of the mob, stepping into the ring felt like breaking through into another world. It was only a rough shape marked out by packing cases and with sawdust scattered across the cobblestones, but it was the reason they were all there. The two combatants were waiting for him, each with their crowd of supporters on the other side of the wooden boxes. Both were stripped to the waist, bruises and cuts from previous bouts showing on their bodies. Jim Tanner was closest to him, and at 20 years old, the senior fighter by 3 years. His flabby body had initially led a lot of men to bet against him, but they had soon found out that he was surprisingly fast, and his weight could be a weapon rather than a hindrance. His chest and back were covered in tattoos. Legend had it that he got a new one for every winning bout. Tanner caught Owens' eye and smiled before spitting on the ground. Tanner wasn't a local guy. Owens had arranged for him to come across from Bristol, where he had garnered a reputation as a vicious fighter. He was the reason for the large turnout, not because people expected him to win, but because an outsider was daring to take on their champion. His opponent was on the other side of the ring. He was easily a head taller than the Bristolian, but then he was taller than most of the men present. Despite his youth, there was a stillness to him, the eye of the storm. Like Tanner, he was sat on a smaller packing box, but his body was lean, muscles showing beneath pale skin with every slight movement. There was power in his frame, coiled and waiting to escape. Owens nodded to one of his men standing on the sidelines, and he started to pound on a large metal box with a plank. The crowd fell silent. Standing in the centre of the ring, Owen began his speech. "Ladies and gentlemen," he shouted, gratified by the slight ripple of laughter that greeted his first word. "Welcome to this evening's entertainment." There was a cheer from the mob. "Tonight we will see two equally matched warriors meeting in this hallowed space. Hercules versus Heracles, Zeus versus Jupiter." There were a few sarcastic oohs from the crowd, and a lone "get on with it." Most here knew Owens' love for music hall, and they were willing to put up with a bit of showmanship before the main event. "On my right," Owens continued, "we have Jim Tanner, the Bristol butcher, the undefeated terror of the Avon." Tanner stood up and bowed to the crowd, revelling in the cheers. "And worst of all," Owens continued, "an Englishman." The cheers turned to boos and laughter. Tanner, caught up in the moment, shook his fists at anyone close by. "And to my left," Owens shouted, aware that the crowd would quieten for his next words, "our local champion, the strongman of Swansea, the All-England Cornish Wrestling Champion of 1903, the Welsh warrior, Jack Lemm." The crowd erupted. Jack stood up and threw his arms wide, flexing his muscles. One of the men behind him passed him a long iron bar. The tall man held it above his head and effortlessly bent it into a V-shape. He tossed it to the ground amidst a fusillade of cheers. Owens let the crowd die down a bit before continuing. "Gentlemen, he said, addressing the two men in the ring. "This is a wrestling match. I don't want to see any punching or biting or gouging. You're not in a back alley, you're in God's own Swansea." Another cheer. "And the winner will take his prize money away only if I judge it to have been a fair fight." Both men nodded, and the crowd quietened again as they took their opening stances. Owens took a square of cloth out of his pocket and held it above his head. "Let battle commence!" he yelled. The cloth hit the ground, and Owens, never mistaken for a foolish man, got out of the way as fast as he could.
It wasn't a long walk home from the docks, and Jack was certainly not wanting for company. His body ached from the treatment Tanner had dealt it. The man fought dirty, but in the end, he'd lost. Most of the men surrounding Jack on his walk had won money because of it. They were happy, and when they got home, their wives would be happy with a little extra going into the savings. At least it meant Jack wouldn't get dark looks from the women in the morning. He just fought. It was their husband's fault if they lost money on him, but he still got some of the blame if it happened. A man Jack vaguely recognised as living 2 streets over from him slapped him on the back as he passed. "Excellent fight, man," he called out. Jack smiled and waved back, not showing that the friendly blow had hit him exactly where Tanner had got in a series of close rabbit punches out of sight of Owens. Something had cracked inside him, he was sure. But it would heal. Besides, when he had Tanner pinned to the ground, face pushed into the cobbles and one hand slapping the stone to submit, it had been worth it. His prize money helped too, but the real reason he did it was for that moment. Frank Owens had thrown in that line about his Cornish wrestling title, and it was true, but that was more a formal fight than he'd had here. Rules were just suggestions in a street wrestling match, and in all honesty Jack was prouder of his victory here than at the championships. It was turned 10 o'clock, and a warm autumn night. More of the well-wishers had peeled off now to go to their homes. The streets were dark, but the sound of raucous singing as the men parted could be heard clearly from beyond the houses. Jack was left with his thoughts. He could see and hear the railway to his right, the clink and rumble of loading stock being moved along the lines, filled with goods brought off the docks. Bound for big cities, for England, maybe even Scotland, places Jack knew he would never see. Further off, the night glowed with a fierce heat coming from the Morpher copper works. Large groups of chimneys pierced the night sky, some with flames atop them, all pushing out thick, acrid smoke. Huge piles of slag glittered darkly in the distance. The vicar at St. John's had, from the comfort of his pulpit, likened the sight of the foundries at night to hell. He was new to the area, spoke with an English accent, and after the service a few of his parishioners had pulled him aside to explain the error of his description, given that most of his congregation worked, or had family that worked, at the foundries. All the same, Jack could see his point. He was glad he worked on the docks. The breeze coming off the Tor as it made its way to Swansea Bay helped to keep most of the foul-smelling copper smoke away, and it was honest work. As one of the strongest men there, even at age 17, he was in demand. As long as his back held out, he could get any overtime he wanted. As he turned into Jersey Street and looked down the terraces towards his home, the thought of overtime seemed good. Not because of the money, but because it kept him away from here. Jack was a big man, 6'4" in his stocking feet, but something about opening the door to this house always made him feel small. It wasn't having to duck slightly to get in through the door. It wasn't moving around the cramped conditions. Those were so common to him now as to be almost unconscious reflexes. It was the people there. Well, one person. As he stepped into the living room, his mother looked up at him. She was sat over by the fireplace, even though the grate was empty, softly illuminated by a gas lamp. She smiled as he came in and lifted a finger to her lips. Her eyes darted to the back door. Jack smiled in return and nodded. He lifted a hand to indicate he was going upstairs, to the room he shared with his younger brother, but winced in the action as another bruise revealed itself. His mother started to get up out of concern, but Jack shook his head, waving her back down into her seat. "All's good," he whispered. His mother still looked concerned, but a noise from outside made her focus on a more immediate problem. Before she could look back at Jack, the door from the backyard opened, and Jack's father stumbled in from the privy, fastening the belt on his trousers as he came. As he saw Jack, he stopped and scowled. There was a moment of silence as the two men looked at each other, and then Jack turned to go up the stairs. "No time for your father, then?" the older man barked at him. He was speaking in Greek, the language the whole family used at home, the language he'd been born into. Jack considered answering him in Welsh. They could all speak both languages and varying degrees of English, but he knew that his father hated hearing anything but his mother tongue in the house. "It's a family thing," he would say. "Heritage." But perhaps this was not the time to poke the bull. All the same, Jack couldn't help his reply. "Does my father now have time for me, then?" Giovanni Lamnia Sr. took a step towards his son, and Jack instinctively squared his footing ready for a fight. "Don't make me laugh, boy," said his father. "I'll have you on your back before you know it." "A bigger man than you tried tonight," Jack threw back, "but he didn't manage it." Immediately he regretted saying it, but the old man had already seized upon it. "I thought as much. Off fighting for money again. Well, it's better than those displays you give on the sands, flexing your muscles and bending iron. I don't know why people crowd around you for it. They must be weak in the head." Jack had been giving displays of his prowess on the sands for 4 months. It had started with him lifting his friends up, one hanging off each arm, and had developed into a sort of show, lifting heavy rocks, splitting them later with a hammer, arm wrestling and testing his strength against others from the docks. His audience was equally split between men who envied him and women who wanted him, and although he had not started out with it in mind, Jack enjoyed the attention of both. "I do it because I enjoy it," Jack replied, "and because they like to see it. Where's the harm in it? You know how hard it is working the docks or the factory like Mam. So what if there's a little bit of fun at the end of the day? So what if the men want to try to better me and the women like to watch? It's no different to me playing rugby. What's it to you?" Giovanni spat on the floor between them. "It's unseemly. It brings our name down, lets people laugh at the antics of the Lamnia. You think it is just about you, but it's my name too. Your mother's name, your brother, your sister Ellen, although now she is married she can hide the disgrace behind her husband's name." Jack's fists were clenched by his side. It wasn't a new argument. He wished it was. He knew he could never win his father over. Despite having been in this country for over 30 years, Giovanni's mind was still on the small island of Syros off the coast of Greece. Jack had never been there, but if he did, he imagined he would find it full of straight-laced people, hard-working but inflexible in their ways, noble but stern, and everyone else would be a disappointment to them. Jack stood much taller than the old man. Giovanni was 62 years old, but still working as an able seaman on the Prestonian, the steamer that carried whatever was needed to wherever needed it. He lied about his age to get the work, adding 13 years to his birth date, but he could get away with it. His muscular body was twisted by the hard work that had got him this far, by the graft that he had put in to survive in a foreign country. It could not have been easy starting a family in a strange land, and part of Jack admired that man, the family man, the honourable man. But all too often, the face he presented these days was a bitter one, of a man who was coming to the end of a hard life, and who knew it. A man who clung to his name and reputation as the most important things left to him. Unfortunately, Jack couldn't get him to see that his wrestling, his shows on Swansea sands, his growing reputation didn't harm the family name at all. If anything, it promoted it. "So, hand over the money." His father's words snapped him back to the moment. "What?" said Jack. "If you're going to drag the family name through the mud, we should at least get the benefits from it. Give me your winnings." Stood up. "Now, Gio, there's no need for that. I'm sure Jack will use some of it for the rest of the family anyway." "This is no concern of yours, Rowena," her husband snapped, and she sat back down again. Jack hated seeing his mother like this. She was a hard-working woman herself, spending long hours alongside his eldest sister at the copper works. They wouldn't have the house if she hadn't been working there. It was a company lodging, as they all were in the surrounding streets, and although the docks were technically there to service the incoming raw copper for smelting on site, he would not have been offered a house just on those grounds. It was even worse for his father. As a seaman in the mercantile marine, he was away from home for long periods, and the money he brought back was not enough to buy a house. He knew the old man was aware that the roof over his head wasn't something he himself had earned, and he also knew that it ate him up inside. I'll give the money to Mum, Jack said, but his father shook his head. You'll give it to me. He glanced at his mother. Out of sight of her husband, she gave a quick nod. Jack pulled the money out of his trouser pocket. £5, hard-earned and easily lost. Giovanni took the money and stuffed it in his own pocket without a word. Now get to bed, he scowled. When he had entered the house, the opportunity to lie in his own bed and relax his aching muscles was all that Jack had wanted. Now it seemed like giving in. He winked at his mother and turned on his heel. As he stepped back out onto the street, he could hear the impotent fury of his father behind him. It had been a bold move, but potentially a stupid one. Jack couldn't go back to the house that night. He knew that his father would sit up in the living room, watching the door until he fell asleep in his chair, waiting for the chance to lambast his son again, or dreaming of winning the argument that would follow. He could probably stay with Ellen. His sister lived only a few streets over. Her husband was a good man, and he knew enough of Ellen's own problems at home to give Jack a space on the floor for the night. Turning up his collar against a night that suddenly seemed a lot less hospitable than it had earlier, Jack set off towards her house. The streets were quieter now. No singing could be heard on the night breeze, no laughter. Everyone was home in bed or passed out in a gutter somewhere. It felt like Jack had the whole world to himself. He walked for a little while, happy in his own thoughts. The fight had been a good one. Most of the lads around the docks had already tried their hand at beating him, either in feats of strength or in a wrestling bout, and he'd found there was something quite commonplace about them. They were enthusiastic amateurs with no skill, no grace. Tanner, however, was a veteran like himself. He could feel the memory of hundreds of throws in his stance. His opponent's every move had been created from the knowledge of moves that brought victory and mistakes that did not. It had been a fight that tested his experience against someone else's equal experience, and that had made it a memorable evening. As he turned into his sister's street, Jack saw a figure up ahead of him. Something about the way the man was standing, looking up at the houses, made him look lost. It was a surprise to see anyone on the streets at this time, and more so for it to be a face that Jack didn't know. The surprises continued, however, as he drew closer to the man. Jack? Jack Lemm? Jack looked the man up and down. It was dark, but he was evidently wearing fancier clothes than you would find on a dock worker outside of his wedding day. Yes, Jack replied. You have me at a disadvantage. We've never met, said the man, offering a hand to shake, but I watched you fight tonight. Excellent work. The man was Welsh, but his accent wasn't local. William Coots, he said, as they shook hands. But you can call me Billy. I'm the manager of both the Palace Theatre and the Star Theatre in town. Jack knew of the Palace Theatre, of course. Frank Owen seemed to spend all his time there when not organising fights or working, but he'd never been. Unknown quantity to him, as he'd only put on plays, and they'd always seemed a bit daunting to him. There was a slight echo of his father as he realised he thought it was a waste of money, a frippery he could do without. Before Jack could say anything, Billy Coots was jumping in again. Now, this may seem a little strange, but I'm actually walking the streets tonight looking for you. Well, I was. I think some of your friends sent me the wrong way as a joke. Very funny. You see, I want to make you an offer. Jack looked suspiciously at him. Well, full disclosure, tonight wasn't the first time I've seen you. I first noticed you, or rather the crowds you were attracting, on the sands. I mean, what you do there, the weightlifting, it's incredible. I saw when you picked those 4 girls up, 2 hanging from each arm. You should have been there the next time, Jack said. I did 6. Brilliant, Billy exclaimed. His enthusiasm was apparent, even if the reason for his being there still wasn't. Well, I'd like to offer you the chance to do that again and get paid for it. Strongman acts are all the rage at the moment, and with you we've got our very own homegrown one. How'd you like 3 nights a week, one of them Saturday, on stage at the Palace as part of my music hall lineup? You get a cut of the door take, and you'd only be working 30 minutes a night at most. But what would I do? Jack asked. Just what you're doing now. Feats of strength, trials of power. We can challenge members of the audience to better you, lift heavy weights, perhaps even fight you. Well, no, okay, we can discuss that bit. But just think of it, your name on a marquee, on a poster. Jack Lemm, strongman. Billy was quite carried away with his sales pitch. Jack stood in the street and thought about it. It was getting late in the year, so he knew he'd have to stop doing the sands soon, as the nights drew in. and this was guaranteed pay for doing something he loved anyway. There was only one problem, the same one he'd just walked out on. "If I do it," he said cautiously, "I don't want to be Jack Lemm. I'd rather be something else. Something local. How does Swansea Jack sound?" Billy looked slightly disappointed, but he knew a deal-breaker when he heard one, so he nodded slowly. "Swansea Jack, strongman. Yes, I think we can work with that." Jack stuck out his hand again, but before he shook on the deal, another thought struck him. Something Frank Owens had said earlier on. How about Swansea Jack, the Welsh Hercules? Billy grinned in the darkness.